Hi, it's Mo. It is March, and in March I had planned to do a bunch of try chapters. I did one, and now I'm already behind. My goal with doing try chapters in March is my TBR month. It's the month where I go through my TBR. I have been cleaning and organizing my TBR. I switched a lot of things around on my TBR. I put a bunch of books downstairs in the basement as I was doing my basement box books. So I've been bringing some books up too from the basement. The point of doing try chapters this month is because I want to get rid of books. I have 12 books over here, 4 piles of 3 that I could do try chapters with later in the month as well. And I have a stack of 4 books here that I want to do a try chapter with today. As I've been clearing off my TBR, I've been assessing books that I probably don't need on my TBR anymore. Either they are just not the book for me, or they're a book that I got because it looked cool but I didn't really know what it was about. And the first of those is Mother Country by Irina Rain. I was interested in this one because I believe it's set in Brooklyn, and this is a Ukrainian author and a Ukrainian story, so I've never read anything from the Ukraine or by a Ukrainian author. It was written in 2019, so before the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine, the war in Russia and Ukraine were happening. So I think it would be an interesting story, especially it's an immigrant story. I do like all those things, and I like stories about that, but I think this is like a mother-daughter story and like an intergenerational family story, and those I don't like so much. So I have a feeling that this just might not be the book for me, even though it has a bunch of my buzzwords, including that it's set in Brooklyn. The next story is a nonfiction. This is called 3 Women by Lisa Taddeo. I thought that this was a fiction when I first got it, and I know Lisa Taddeo's book Animal a lot of people really love. I love nonfiction, but I think that this again is like a look at 3 women, and I think it's probably going to be very womanhood centered, which I don't mind, but I also don't love. Like the nonfiction that I read about women, I like to read about women doing something, you know? I like to read about women who are pioneers, women who are homesteaders, women who have to fight for their education, women who create things. So I'm not saying that this isn't that, but I have a feeling that it's just the lives of these 3 women and the juxtaposition of the 3 women and kind of how women live current day, which is not what I usually gravitate towards. So I definitely want to give this a try and see if I enjoy it or not. Next, we have Pineapple Street by Jenny Jackson. Again, this is a book set in Brooklyn, so that was really the reason why I picked it up. I like the idea of learning more about like Brooklyn Heights and about this family who's lived in Brooklyn Heights for many years. It is a intergenerational tale, I believe, which makes me think that I won't love it, but I think it's all set during the same time period, so I think it's like several generations living in a Brooklyn brownstone. That all sounds amazing, but everything I've heard about this book is that it's like rich white people doing rich white people things. That is not the kind of story that I like. Even though it's set in Brooklyn, I want to give this one a chapter or so and see if I enjoy it. Finally, in this try chapter, I want to try Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. I love this cover. It's so stunning. Anything with Hokusai on it is like pretty good for me. But this story is about 2 young people who meet while they're both in the hospital. They become friends, and then they become partners in a video game company. That all does not sound interesting to me at all. And I've also heard that it is very like heartwarming and heart-wrenching, and again, I don't know how I feel about that. I do think there's a queer element in this, which I enjoy, but I really picked this book up because of the hype, and I don't usually like to read hype books. I think I just saw it. I got it right when it was super popular in a little free library, and I just couldn't pass it up, but I don't think it's going to be a book for me. I do know people in my real life who have read this and enjoyed it, but I don't think it's my kind of book, so we will see. So I'll be trying a chapter or so. Sometimes I read less than a chapter, sometimes I read slightly more, or if there aren't chapters, I just determine how long I feel of these 4 books, and we will decide what we're going to keep and what we're going to let go of. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I mentioned here. Let me know what you thought of them. Once I read a couple of chapters, I will come back to you. We are back. It is a few days later, but I have now read the first chapter, sort of these 4 books. So let's talk about them in the order that I read them. The first chapter that I read was Mother Country by Irina Rain. I actually read the prologue, which is called War, and it says Ukraine, April 2014. And I read like 2 or 3 pages of this. It starts with a transcript of an interview conducted with a 27-year-old school teacher living in the Donbass region of Ukraine. And it says it's from the New York Times. Now, I'm unclear as to whether this is fiction or not. I assume it's fiction because of the way it's written and because I don't think it's like cited anywhere that it's an actual interview. And then I also read the first 2 or 3 pages of the first chapter, which says First World Problems, Brooklyn, April 2014. So the prologue set in Ukraine is an interview with a woman, and it's kind of in the choral voice, the we voice of how life is for them amid bombings and conflict. And I don't know enough about Ukrainian history, even just 10 years ago, to know like what the conflict was, what the warring was going on. I assume it's a problem with Russia because of the current conflict that's going on in modern day, in current day, real life, Russia and Ukraine, the war that is happening there. So I assume it's a precursor to the war that is going on now. In the choral voice, it talks about how, like, you wake up to bombings, you hear it, you feel the building shaking, and you put on your best underwear because if you have to walk to work and you get killed on the way, or if, you know, you have to go to school or wherever you're going and you get killed on the way, you want to make sure that you have like your best undergarments on when they find your body. It talks about living life in time of a war and how even though it's completely unreal and unrealistic to live a normal life, you have to try the best you can to live a normal life. If the bombing gets so loud that you know that the building might be bombed, then you're gonna leave the building, but like until then, you and the cat and the kids are gonna like hide in the bathroom, the smallest, deepest room in the house. So that part was really interesting, and I was really compelled to read more of that. It was very hard to read, but it was very interesting. And then when I skipped ahead to the Brooklyn part, we are following Nadia, who is from the Ukraine, but she is a nanny in Brooklyn currently. It seems like she does work for another Eastern European person who kind of understands her mentality, but also she's the only Ukrainian person in the area. So we hear a little bit about how she doesn't really speak English, but she's taking care of this Eastern European / American child. The few phrases that she knows in English to be able to talk to the child in, and the few interactions that she has with Americans. During these interactions, she's thinking all about her daughter and her life back in Ukraine, and that she feels guilty for watching someone else's children and not taking care of her own child. So that part really lost me, and I don't know, because that prologue is just a prologue and there don't seem to be any other elements of that. I don't know if we're going to get back to that kind of story. Obviously, Nadia maybe was one of the women in that interview, so maybe she will be going back to her past and describing life in Ukraine during that time. But overall, the writing was like for me, and the story and definitely hearing about people's kids is like not something I'm interested in, so I'm not sure about this one. Next, I did a little more research into Three Women by Lisa Taddeo, and by research I mean I read the beginning of the blurb on the back, which of course I had never read. This is Lisa Taddeo writing a nonfiction following 3 women and following like their sex lives. So like one woman is a mother in suburbia whose marriage has lost its passion. Another person is a young 17-year-old girl who's having an affair with a English teacher. And the third person is a happily married woman who runs a successful restaurant, and she engages in sex outside of her marriage for her partner to watch. So that was the one that intrigued me the most. So in this book, I read a little tiny bit of the author's note, and the little tiny bit that I did read was really intriguing because it talks about how Lisa Taddeo has known these women and followed these women and pursued their lives for like 8 years, and that the majority of this book is directly from them talking to her and describing what's going on. She's even moved to the cities where they lived to spend time with them, and then other accounts come from like their diaries or their recollections. So I thought that was interesting, but I didn't want to read too much. And then there's a little prologue, which I didn't really read because I decided that I wanted to skip to the most interesting to me woman's story, and of course that is Sloane, who owns a successful restaurant. It's divided into chapters of the 3 women, and I started reading Sloane's chapter, and it's kind of going through describing her. I read about 3 or 4 pages of this chapter, describing her husband, describing her life, describing her work in the restaurant to a certain degree, and then also talking about how rumors are flying, how they live in a very small beach town that most people leave during the off season. So like total buzzwords for me. Restaurant industry, beach town, off season. Yes, partly because they live in the off season, the way their lives work, and how they are subject to the gossip of people living there because it's such a small place. So I read a couple of pages of that, and this one I found really intriguing. Next, I read a little bit of Pineapple Street by Jenny Jackson. So I read the entire prelude, which follows a young man named Curtis McCoy, and he is sitting at a cafe in Brooklyn Heights in Brooklyn, New York, and he's waiting for something. I can't remember already what it was, but he is listening to the table next to him where 2 young girls are talking with their mother, and they're all trying to use a dating app for one of the children, for one of the girls, and they're like trying to match her up with people from the dating app, and it's kind of funny and it's kind of poignant. Curtis is kind of listening into all this when he realizes that he knows one of these girls, but now that he's been listening into their conversation, he doesn't feel like he can interrupt them to say hello to her. And then we move on to people-focused chapters. So we have Sasha, Georgina, and a bunch of other people. I read a little bit of Sasha's chapter, and it was kind of about how Sasha moved in to her husband's house, her husband's family's house in Brooklyn Heights, and how she is waiting for the family to like move the rest of their stuff out. You know, she wants to make the house her own. She wants to be a good wife to her husband, but like their stuff is still there, and when they drop by, it's like they still own the place, which technically they do. Sasha and her husband are just renting it, and how they make Sasha feel small when they come by because they bring more expensive food, or they don't like her wine selection, or whatever. And then I kind of skipped around and I just read like a little bit here and there of other characters, and I see that some of the character chapters that we're going to get are characters from the first prelude area, so you're going to find out like more about what was going on with that, and I would assume that we're going to come back to the first person, the man, Curtis, who was eavesdropping on them. I liked that it had a lot to do with Brooklyn Heights and Brooklyn, and it mentioned a lot of places that I know, and then I recognized there was a little bit of atmosphere about the house that Sasha lives in and the brownstone and Brooklyn in general, so I enjoyed that part of it. Next, I read a little bit of Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. This has chapter breaks, and it starts with sick kids, and it introduces Mazur, who we find out very quickly that he used to be Samuel Mazur, and then he was Samuel Masur, and then before that he was just Sam, and when he played video games he was Sam. So I thought that was a really cute and very like literary introduction. It talks about a little bit just about his life and who he she was. And then I definitely skipped around. I don't think I read more than 2 or 3 pages of this. So I skipped to the next chapter, which is chapter 2, and then we meet Sadie. And when Sadie first met Sam, she was in the hospital. Sam was in the hospital. Sadie was there with her older sister who was battling leukemia, and Sam was there because he had like fractured his ankle or something. So then obviously we're going to meet them together and how they met, and we're going to learn more about how they became friends. So a lot of it is like dialogue. It's pretty dialogue heavy. It obviously is going to have something to do with like video games and how they bond over video games, but on the whole, it wasn't like grabbing my attention. Again, I don't really want to read about like teenagers or kids necessarily. I mean, I can if I'm in the right mood, but like, and the way that it was a little bit like overwritten and over flowery wasn't like grabbing my attention. Am I going to keep any of these books? Am I going to unhaul them? Mother Country, I'm going to unhaul. This one is the one I'm the most on the fence about because I did find the description of Ukraine really interesting. I would love to read a book from a Ukrainian author. I would love to read a book about conflicts in Ukraine and the idea of immigrants from Ukraine coming to America, but on the whole, I think this is going to be a little too much about motherhood, a little too much about children, and I'm just really not interested. I do think this is a really beautiful cover, so I'm sad on multiple levels that I'm not going to keep this one, but the cover is that like really waxy, like rubbery type cover, and I don't really like those. So I don't think physically the sensation of reading this would be exciting, and I don't think the story itself would grab me necessarily. So this is an unhaul. 3 women I am going to keep. I don't necessarily like to read about people's sex lives, and that to me is probably not the most interesting part of this book, but I really, really loved the writing, and I really liked the glimpses that we were definitely going to get into Sloane's life as a restaurateur and as a front of house person in a restaurant. So I'm super excited for that. And I think her life already sounds interesting. So if her life is interesting, I bet the lives of the other 3 women are interesting as well. I also think that the introduction or the author's note was really intriguing to me, and I would love to go back and read the full author's note and also the full prologue. Like I said, I didn't read any of that in this Try a Chapter. So this one was really intriguing to me. It's a nonfiction too, which I definitely love nonfiction, and so I'm definitely going to be keeping it. Pineapple Street, although I enjoyed the Brooklyn parts, like it was almost like too much. It was almost like, see, I know Brooklyn. I've been to Brooklyn. I've lived in Brooklyn Heights. And I didn't like the pretentious nature of the writing and that feeling that it gave me. And then also the people involved already, like every person that I read from, except I guess that prologue with Curtis, I really didn't like. Curtis sounded kind of interesting, but when is he going to come back up in the story? And am I going to care about any of the other people involved? So I will be unhauling this one. Another reason why I feel safe about unhauling this one is that I've seen it many times. I actually passed this one up at a little free library once and then found it at a Goodwill and decided to get it. So if I need to get this one, I'm sure I could get it again. Finally, tomorrow, I am also going to unhaul. I had a feeling I was going to unhaul this one. I had a feeling even before I picked this one up that this was not a book for me, and I don't think Gabrielle Zevin is for me. I think her stories are going to be a little too heartwarming, a little too twee, a little too pull at your heartstrings, like, oh, look at these kids meeting in a hospital. It's not really my kind of book. I think that I just was swept up in the hype of this book, and I also think that I was swept up in this beautiful cover. I do love this cover. I think it's absolutely stunning, and for that I'm sad that it won't be on my shelves, but for every other reason I am happy to unhaul this one. So I would call that an incredibly productive Try a Chapter. Out of the 4 books that I tried, I am only keeping 1 book, so 3 are going in the unhaul pile, which is great. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I tried a chapter of here. Let me know what you thought of them. Let me know if you think I'm making a terrible mistake by unhauling some of them. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!